let's begin with some breaking news. Just in the past few days, you know that there was a ceasefire that fell apart in Syria. John Kerry and Minister Lavrov, the foreign minister, had been working very hard to try to get this ceasefire. It fell apart, and then all of a sudden, I think the United States felt that it had been led along by the nose by the Russians for quite a long time, and a truly acrimonious period broke out. And it's shocking, just in the last week, think about it, President Putin said he was halting an agreement on disposing of plutonium, which is, you know, a part of the fuel for nuclear weapons. He put anti-aircraft missiles in Syria. He sent more missiles to Kaliningrad, which is that Russian enclave near Poland, all the way into Europe. He said, by the way, I may reopen bases in Cuba and Vietnam, all in just a few days. So we are back to something that some are calling the new Cold War. And I do think that that really is apt terminology. I can tell you, you know, I go to Russia quite a lot. I was there just a couple of months ago, maybe going back by the end of the year. And there is, and I'm sorry to say, but there is really a feeling of almost war fever. Just recently this week, Russians carried out an exercise in which civilians, emergency crews, etc., simulated what they would do in some type of a major emergency. And it really was almost a wartime scenario. As I was in Moscow, as I said a couple of months ago, the feeling was very much among the people that I talked to that war was about to break out, and that would be war with the United States. I had a taxi driver say, when is the war going to begin? And I looked at him and I said, wait a minute, you know, war? Are you actually talking about war? And he said, yes, we're all very frightened that there's going to be war between the United States and Russia. And I had to tell him, you know, nobody wants war, but he was very frightened. I talked to a producer who was with CNN, who comes from kind of a working class, young guy, kind of a working class neighborhood. And I said to him, Arkady, what's happening in your neighborhood? What's the scuttlebutt? What are people talking about in terms of relations with the United States? And do you know what he said? He said, well, my neighbors are buying matches, salt, and kasha. And kasha is like a grain. And matches, salt, and kasha are what Russians did during World War II to be prepared for any eventuality. So this is not a joke. You hear more open talk of Russia's military and nuclear prowess. There's more saber rattling. And there really is this feeling that that Russia is ready to respond militarily to the United States. So how did we get here? Okay, so that's where I'd like to kind of go back to that period at the end of the Soviet Union, the beginning of modern Russia. 1991, I mentioned December 31st, or actually Christmas Day, 1991. I was working at the White House. I covered the White House for about, I guess, 6 years. And I was new, low man on the totem pole, so I had to work Christmas. And I was at the White House, and I thought, oh, nothing's going to happen. This is going to be so boring. And then all of a sudden, the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, it was like all of a sudden the news flash, Soviet Union is being dissolved. The flag, if you remember, some of you may remember, the Soviet flag at the corners of the Kremlin was lowered, and the modern Russian flag was raised. I stood there on the lawn, and I thought, this country that I have been interested in since I was 13 years old, when I started studying the Russian language, doesn't exist anymore. And I had real trouble even grasping that, as I know some people in the State Department and the White House and everybody else, the Pentagon, had difficulty wrapping their heads around that too. But all of a sudden it was over. But I really would make the argument that the Soviet Union really did not dissolve. And this is one of the problems that I think plagues the relationship. There is very much a feeling in the West, certainly in the United States, that it was almost kind of like ding dong, the witch is dead. You know, that the Soviet Union's over, they will come and be part of the West. Communism is dead as well, or at least communist control, and we can work with them. There was a bit of kind of triumphalism, which galled Vladimir Putin at that point. But it was too early to really think about that. But certainly everyone kind of felt we don't have to worry about communism anymore because after all, it's over. But that way of life, which had existed for 70 years, did not magically disappear. And I think the mentality of Russians, knowing that they were a superpower, and then all of a sudden they were not, is something that they have been trying to emotionally, mentally, and every other way grapple with. And it has created a giant chip on the shoulder of many Russians. And oddly enough, not just people who lived through the Soviet Union, remember the days when Russia really saved the West from Hitler. Not just those people. There are young people today who miss the fact that they are a superpower. There is a poll that I looked at not too long ago that shows that if you look at support for Putin, and remember, you know, the polls, I would take off a certain percentage, maybe 10, 20 points, but Putin's a very popular man in Russia. His ratings are somewhere around 82, 85%. It's incredible. And yet, why is he so popular? That I think Russians, many people in the older generation, remember the good old days and want them to come back. The middle generation, let's say in their 40s and 50s, are split. You know, some support Putin and like him because he's not drunk the way President Yeltsin was. They're proud of that. But the people who are some of the strongest supporters of Putin and this kind of this resurgent Russia are young people. And I mean teenagers and 20-year-olds. Now, why would that be? Because it seems counterintuitive that, you know, your communism is over, they can travel wherever they want, they can listen to any music that they want, they're on the internet just as our young people are. Why would it be that way? But you look statistically, and they are big. I'm saying as a group. This is not everyone. But large numbers of them are very supportive of President Putin. And I think that it is pride that Russia is back on the world stage. It is throwing its weight around, sometimes to its own detriment. But they feel that Russia matters. And Russia matters maybe in our understanding for the wrong things. But Russia does matter. In fact, look at what President Putin said the other day. You know, when this news of Russian hacking came out, he said, well, you know, and this is kind of a dig to President Obama. He said, you know, they were kind of talking about us as a regional power, but it's nice to know that we're the center of the American election campaign. I'm paraphrasing, but very close. And he said, it's very flattering to know that we matter. So he's sticking it to Obama, who did say that they were kind of a regional power and didn't really matter that much. Now, they matter in, I think, many negative ways, but kind of as, well, shall I say the word Donald Trump now? But I will say it once. I say, you know, Donald Trump has said, it doesn't really matter what they say about you as long as they're talking about you. And it's kind of the same mentality that, you know, Russia thinks, listen, as one Russian said to me, they may not love us, but they fear us. And that's a compliment in Russia. So the world fears them. The United States, to a certain extent, is concerned about what they will do. The Baltic countries fear them. There are a lot of people who wonder whether, Russia is going to be on their doorstep. So Russia matters right now. And I think that is a point of pride among a lot of Russians, that they're back on the world stage. I could have sworn that I saw Vladimir Putin out at one of the polling stations around here, but I may be wrong. Is it? Carol, did you see that? Or oh, okay. All right. So not yet, but maybe. And we do have that hacking. So what happens, if you look at the early stages of modern Russia, Russia was a mess. It was very weak. President Yeltsin had said to the different regions of Russia, take as much power as you want. And things were rather chaotic. Power was dispersed in a very broad way. The media were, some of them were kind of bought and sold by oligarchs, but it was pretty much a rough and tumble free media world. Economically, they were kind of a mess. It was a very difficult time, but there were plenty of people there from the West who were giving them advice on what they should do. Russians feel that it was chaotic. The West was kind of happy that the communists weren't in power. And when Vladimir Putin came in, he looked at this, and the biggest danger during Yeltsin's days was really that the country would fall apart or maybe even dissolve into a civil war. And maybe, don't forget, nuclear weapons were dispersed. There were 3 countries that were part of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, that had nuclear weapons. And thank God, the Nunn-Lugar program, which brought those nuclear weapons back to Moscow and out of the regions, out of Ukraine. Ukraine would be a very different situation today if they had nuclear weapons. Think about it. So Putin comes in and he sees chaos, and as a former KGB agent, he had been through periods of chaos before. His station was in Dresden, Germany, during the Cold War. He had seen the fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall, in which the famous story where he was at the Russian consulate, or I guess it was an embassy at that consulate, I guess, and he picked up the phone as crowds were gathering outside. German crowds were gathering outside the Russian embassy, and they weren't friendly. He picked up the phone to Moscow, and as he relates in his autobiographical book written by others, he said, no, I mean that. That's not fair. It was a book written by journalists in which they interviewed him. I'm not saying that he didn't write his own book. He could have written his own book. But it was a book that introduced him in a very personal way to Russians in his early stages. So he said he picked up the phone to Moscow, and Moscow didn't answer in 1989. So that was chaos point number 1. Then he goes back, the wall falls, then the Soviet Union falls apart. And that's another period where he had been in Germany. He wasn't in Moscow during the ferment of that changeover to the end of Gorbachev and the beginning of Yeltsin and the democratic ferment, albeit chaotic. He wasn't part of that. So he gets back to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and then St. Petersburg, and he sees more chaos that he's not used to. So that's chaotic point number 2. And he vowed that that would not happen again. And another factor, I think, in the Psychology 101 of Vladimir Putin is that he comes from Leningrad. And, I mentioned I was an exchange student, so I spent first a summer, as I know Margot was an exchange student, and probably there are some other people who were as well. And, Leningrad was a very difficult place in 1969 and 1970. It was dark. It felt like World War II had just ended. We had regular outages of hot water. The fuel would, at that point, gas and oil, there were certain problems with that. We didn't have hot water in our dormitory. And so I used to have to go to the banya. And the banya is a bathhouse. And there I would see these women, who had actually, at that point, gone through World War II, gone through the blockade of Leningrad by the Nazis, and had really literally starved. People died. In fact, in President Putin's own family, his mother almost died of starvation. I believe the story because it's just so typical of what happened. She was almost hauled off to a common grave, to a cemetery, but they discovered at the last minute she was still breathing because she collapsed from hunger. His father went to the front, shot up unmercifully, came back, was in a hospital, and then was sent back to the front again. And his little brother, what would have been his older brother, Putin was born after the war in 1952, but what would have been his older brother died, they think, of dysentery when he was, I believe, 3, maybe 2 or 3. And until very recently, they did not even know where his little body was buried. His body ended up in a common grave along with thousands of other Russians in a cemetery that's called Piskaryovskaya Cemetery. So President Putin, whether, people like him or not, has a lot of personal history of Russia falling apart, vulnerable, attacked, and insulted, he would say, by the West. So my Psychology 101 is that Vladimir Putin has decided that this is not going to happen on his watch. And he is bound and determined to put Russia back on the international stage. He is bound and determined to do everything that he possibly can to parlay whatever power they have to make Russia a key player. Witness what's happening in Syria. And I'm sure there'll be some questions on that. But, part of that obviously was to rescue President Assad of Syria, but it was also to make sure that Russia is a factor in whatever the ultimate solution for that conflict will be. And he's done that, you could argue, quite skillfully in Syria. He has injected himself around the world. He is now very much a player in the Middle East. He has this would be, I think, a malevolent side of his foreign policy, but he has created these, conflicts in different countries in the perimeter, which are unresolved conflicts, in which he can continue to keep countries in the neighborhood relatively weak. Witness Georgia. I know some people you came back from Georgia. Witness Ukraine with Crimea, which is now part of Russia. He's played his cards pretty well. So how did he do it? And here I'll do a little skip and a jump. Maybe, Carol, you can keep me honest on the time. So maybe another 10, 15 minutes, something like that, and then we'll get to questions. But so how did he do it? One of the first things he did was to control the media, because he knew, as a former KGB person who understands that in Russia, the media are very important. Saturation of television, even in the, most, I was going to say, deaf. The Russians call them deaf places, these towns in the hinterland that are very, very primitive. This penetration of TV is in the 90s, 95%, 92, 95%. A lot of people watch TV. So controlling the media was very important. How did he do it? Primarily, there were cases, in fact, I witnessed them myself, where you had guys with guns at the door for one of the stations called NTV. But a lot of it was financial control, allowing people who were close to the Kremlin to buy up broadcasting stations. It could mainly television, some radio. And then they were friendly to the Kremlin. And they were all of a sudden part of this system of state-owned TV. Some are owned outright by the state, but a lot of others are simply cozy relationships with people who are close to Putin or close to the power structure. So that was one thing that he did. Then I think after controlling the media, and I should say there are a few outlets that are still pretty, you could call them opposition, but they have really been marginalized. And the people who work for them, I consider some of the bravest journalists in the world, because they know that if they get on the wrong side of somebody, they can be murdered. And you remember Anna Politkovskaya, who reported on Chechnya, the war in Chechnya, who was gunned down in the entrance to her building. I knew her. And, you know, I was covering Russia at that time, the bureau chief. And these things definitely happened and can happen today. So you control the media. Then you try to put together, and this is where it gets, I think, very interesting, a national idea of what Russia is. Now, the American idea would be democracy, freedom, democracy, human rights, First Amendment rights, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You too can be a business person and be successful, and immigrants are welcome, and we can all do it together. We have, you know, since, like, I grew up in the 1950s with that, you know, very specific understanding of what America's all about. Russia, just as President Putin, could not really come to terms with what it was all about when the Soviet Union ended. In fact, they had a commission. They actually had a commission that was put together by President Yeltsin to develop a national idea, nationalna idea. So this commission met for about a year. It was kind of the graybeards, you know, the thinkers, the intellectuals. They got together, and a year later, they disbanded and threw up their hands and said, we don't know. We cannot come up with a national idea. So Putin has slowly but surely put together this parts of this national idea. And he took a little bit of Tsarism, you know, the old Tsars, which is Mother Russia, empire, proud, intellectual history, culture, Dostoevsky, you know, Chekhov, the ballet, all of this stuff, which Russia is incredible. You know, the level of culture, high culture in Russia, is extraordinarily high. So he takes part of Tsarism, he takes some of the Soviet Union, and primarily he takes the Great War for the Fatherland, better known to us as World War II, and the bravery that the Russians showed, which they really did. We all know what they did during World War II. So World War II right now, when you're in Moscow, you would swear, again, it happened yesterday. Even for people who, you know, 50 years ago, these kids are walking around, and it feels like just yesterday that World War II is over. Enormous pride, and it is pumped up by the national media and used as a unifying factor today. He also used religion, the Russian Orthodox Church, which is very politically connected to the power structure and is interesting, has interesting influence in a lot of different places. Part of the reason that they have a role in Syria was that they support the Christians in Syria, many of whom are Orthodox Christians. There's a big role that the Russian Orthodox Church plays in the Syria connection. Then they also took modern day. Now, the modern day is where I have trouble, because what they say is we are also a modern country. We are technologically sophisticated. And I think this is where it kind of falls apart, because Putin's dilemma, and he is a very intelligent man, he knows that they have existed now for 25 years on oil and gas. And that's how they made their money. And that is why their economy has severe problems. The military, I was looking at some statistics today, he's poured a lot of money into the military, but they are facing 6% cuts every year in the military, which is sacred. for the next 3 years, every year, 6% cut in the military budget, which is almost unheard of. So their economy is not doing well, and it's because of oil and gas and living the good life until prices plummeted in half, essentially, from what they used to be. So he would like to have a technologically sophisticated country, but in order to do that, he has to open up politically and allow people to do unpredictable things, like become entrepreneurs. Some of us were talking about that today. He has to allow a Silicon Valley mentality, which is very disruptive, and disruptive in the good and bad sense of that term. That's something that President Putin has real difficulty doing. So I think he has a dilemma, because he can't open his economy the way it should be opened, but he has to open it if he wants to compete internationally. And then finally, I would say the last part of the equation, that emotional equation, who are we as a people, is a sense of grievance. And this is where we get into very dangerous territory. Russians have a chip on their shoulders. They feel that at the end of the Cold War, that the West rubbed their noses in the fact that the West had so-called won, that they ignored Russia's interests or views on anything. Triumphalism reigned in the West, and Russia meant nothing. And you could make that argument. I think actually part of that really is true. So Putin has taken that to feel that he has tried. He would make the argument, look, after 9/11, I'm the first international leader who called Bush to offer support. And that is true. He was the very first person who called Bush. And he opened the northern passageway so that planes could go into Afghanistan to the United States and to NATO, which was really very surprising. And he feels that he got nothing in return. He feels that he got color revolutions, the so-called color revolutions. In Ukraine, the Orange Revolution. In Georgia, the Rose Revolution. He would even argue that Arab Spring was something that the United States instigated. And he has a personal animosity toward Hillary Clinton because of the demonstrations on the streets of Moscow in 2012 by people over their own demonstrations against the elections. And he blames Hillary Clinton for, quote, giving the sign to those Russian demonstrators to go out in the streets and protest. He literally thinks that the United States is trying to carry out a color revolution against him and depose him. So to him, this is personal. He believes that we're trying to carry out regime change in Russia. Now, if I asked you, you would probably say, no, I don't think that's what the US is trying to do, but he does. So maybe I will begin to kind of wrap up here because I know there are so many questions, but I'll leave you with this thought. You know, I follow media and propaganda a lot. It's something that I'm very, very interested in. And I wrote a thesis, actually, for my master's about this, which was, at that point, let's say 8 years ago, Russia, I kind of thought, was beginning to get its national idea together. And it was beginning to reconstitute the outlets for media, strategy, propaganda, public diplomacy, everything that they had under the Soviets. They were beginning to rebuild it. And at that point, you could almost, I mean, I was kind of lulled into thinking that Russia would get its act together, have an idea about itself, and begin to really go out there and proudly tell the world what Russia has to offer. But it didn't happen that way. What Russia now does in its propaganda, both domestically for its own people, in the neighborhood, which would be former Soviet republics, now independent countries, and internationally is it does not say, here we are, Russia has some of the answers. You know, the way the US says, well, we have democracy, and democracy is a human value that you can ascribe to around the world. Russia doesn't have a prescription, a Russian prescription for the world. But what it does have, it has the ability to criticize the West. And it has the ability to undermine citizens in the West and their faith in democracy and liberal democracy and how it works. And right now, you can see it happening in the United States with this election, with criticism coming from Donald Trump, who says that it's all rigged. You know, the Russians are parroting that back. They don't have to make up any propaganda. All they have to do is quote what's being said. And in Europe, they can say, look at Europe. Look at Europe. They say they're democratic, but then they turn away those migrants, you know? So they can begin to say, and look at the disruption. Europe is chaotic. Europe's falling apart. Europe is collapsing because it's corrupt, morally corrupt. Russia, of course, right now says that it's the moral force in the world. This really is part, I should have mentioned that, in connection with the church, et cetera. Russia literally believes that it is a moral compass in the world that is debauched, especially in Europe and the United States, with gay marriage, crazy, you know, everything that goes on in our society, that we're falling apart morally, and they are the moral force in the world. So I guess what I would say is, if you look at how Russia now exploits its power, it's a spoiler. Russia is a spoiler. I say this with all the love in my heart for Russia, which could be better. But right now, it's playing the role of spoiler. And that can be very effective because the West does have problems. There is a crisis in how liberal democracy can provide what the people actually need, jobs, education, et cetera. It's fueling the election debates that we have in the United States, and it's certainly fueling what's going on in Europe. And I think it is going to be one of the biggest things beyond all sorts of ideologies and all sorts of Republicans and Democrats. You ain't seen nothing yet. When you think what artificial intelligence and robotics will mean to our societies very soon, there will be fewer jobs. There will be more societal chaos. There will be more need to help people who are falling to the bottom. And Vladimir Putin knows this. As I said, he's intelligent. And so he exploits that, not with an answer, but by undermining our faith as Western people in how our societies should function. So he is presenting a challenge that you could argue is almost a more disturbing challenge than during the Cold War. I mean, in the Cold War, it was what? The ideology, Marxism, Leninism versus capitalism. That seems so easy and clean compared to today. And it was. I think it was less dangerous, although we almost blew each other up. But we can still blow each other up because we have weapons right now, fewer of them, but they are on hair trigger alert, aimed at each other. And the new president, I keep saying to my friends who say, well, nukes, you know, isn't that all Cold War? No. The new president, whoever he or she will be, if there is some type of attack or new, indication that there is an attack, will have approximately 15 minutes to make up their minds how to respond. Because the missiles can be here in less than a half an hour. That is shocking when you think that. Just think about that. That's why they all get gray hair, I guarantee, because the gravity of these decisions. So Vladimir Putin, again, I don't like to say, oh, he's a threat, all of this kind of freighted terminology. Vladimir Putin is playing his hand the way he wants to play his hand. He's going to play it both for his country and for his own interest, his own power, staying in power, and the people who are in power with him. But it is going to be a challenge that we're not quite understanding, It's not good versus evil. It's much more complicated. And a lot of it is he is exploiting the very weaknesses that we have in our society that are only going to get worse. So I would argue that the best way to deal with Russia, we have to have a very sane and kind of rational approach, but we also have to look at the issues that are weaknesses in our society and begin to fix them. Because if we don't, it's going to be very easy for Putin or whoever, it could be, post-Putin could be worse. There is that theory in Moscow, well, you don't like Putin, we'll wait who's coming next, see who's coming next. That's possible. So whoever it's going to be over there could be a real challenge in ways we don't understand. So on that cheery note, I will leave you with, I think it was almost impressionistic what I was trying to tell you, but what I wanted, because I know you probably, the level of, I think, understanding of Russia is probably quite high in this room, so I didn't want to kind of go through something that was very predictable, but to bring you my impressions really hot off the press from being in Russia a lot and a lot recently. In fact, at the end of the month, just in 2.5 weeks or so, I go to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania security conference, and I'm going to be, kind of running around up there talking with people about their feelings of Russia and what's happening. So it's an area I'm very interested in. And I don't know whether I'll end up in Moscow this time, but I'm glad that we'll have an opportunity to discuss some of these issues. So thank you very much.